Today at the National Press Club, co-chair of the Minderoo Foundation, Nicola Forrest, and CEO of Thrive by 5, Jay Weatherill, discussing early childhood and how better education in the early years will drive social and economic success. That's today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. I'm Jane Norman, a director here at the club and also a political reporter with the ABC. Well, today's guests are Minderoo Foundation co-founder Nicola Forrest and Thrive by 5 Chief Executive and former South Australian Premier Jay Weatherill. Together, they are putting childcare policy in the spotlight, campaigning for universal access to a high-quality, affordable early learning system. If you're following us online, you can find us on Twitter. Our user handle is @PressClubAust and our hashtag is NPC. Everyone, please welcome Nicola Forrest and Jay Weatherill. And Nicola, I think you're beginning today's proceedings.
Thank you very much, Jane. And good afternoon, everybody. It is my privilege to be here with you today. I want to talk to you today about what I believe is the greatest travesty facing our nation, and also the greatest opportunity: the healthy and happy development of our children. But first, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This isn't the first time I have stood up in front of a group of people and asked the Australian government to reform its policies on early childhood. I've done it many times. I've been doing it for 20 years. 20 years to be precise, because that's how long ago my husband and I set up the Australian Children's Trust, which is now the Minderoo Foundation. I haven't been alone. I've been part of a growing chorus of public organisations, concerned mums and dads, and scientists. But it's hard not to feel utterly frustrated at the lack of progress and wonder why our politicians haven't listened. Perhaps I've been dismissed because I'm not to be taken seriously. A woman talking about children, of course she cares. Perhaps you just think this is a pet hobby for me, something I do to make myself feel useful. Or maybe you just don't even think there is a problem. Why shouldn't mum stay at home and look after bub for a few years? So what if 1 in 5 Australian kids turns up to their first day of school developmentally delayed? At least the majority are doing fine. Well, I am here to say there is a problem and it's in all our interests to fix it. Yes, I may be a mother of 3 to Sydney, Sophia and Grace, and a co-mother to a 4th, Violet. And yes, I am motivated by the experiences I've had, both raising and losing children. But my dedication to ensuring that every single child born in Australia gets the best start in life is far more than just a personal quest. It's one based on overwhelming scientific evidence. Every minute, 250 children are born across the world. Girls and boys who will grow up to be the women and men who will run our hospitals, our schools, our courts. Here in Australia, 1 child is born every minute and 43 seconds. Our future welfare, prosperity and success as a nation depends on our newborns and ensuring that every single one of them grows up to be kind, capable, productive and resilient. As the great philosopher Jerry Seinfeld said, make no mistake why these children are here. They are here to replace us. The science clearly shows that we have to get it right in the first 5 years. 5 years to ensure that every child has the foundation to develop to the best of his or her potential. You blink and those 5 years are over. A fleeting window of time that science says is pivotal to the emotional, cognitive and social development of your child. But we aren't getting it right. We aren't even close. All children come into this world with so much enthusiasm for life, so much hope, joy and resilience, so much potential. But not all of them go on to lead successful, happy, productive lives. Why? Because we fail so many of them in their earliest years. Currently, more than 20% of our kids have health or developmental vulnerabilities when they start school. For example, they may not be able to concentrate, follow instructions, express themselves or interact with other children or adults, or they may be unusually withdrawn and anxious. According to a national study published last year, children who start school with these developmental delays are a whole 9 months behind their peers by the time they reach year 3, and that's in reading and numeracy. And ultimately, they have fewer employment opportunities down the line. The tragedy is that many of these problems are avoidable. They have arisen because we as a nation are not creating stimulating environments that all under 5s need to flourish. Since we founded the Minderoo Foundation, almost 6 million children have been born in Australia. That's 1.2 million children who have failed to reach their full developmental potential due to the inadequacy of our current government policies. In fact, over the last 2 decades, levels of literacy and numeracy amongst Australian children have not risen, they have declined. And to make matters worse, the steepest declines are in our poorest communities. We are becoming more unequal, not less. It's a disgrace that UNICEF ranks Australia's education system among the most unequal of all developed countries. Now, add to the mix that Australia's expenditure on early childhood education, as a percentage of our GDP, is one of the lowest among OECD countries. But I want to make it clear, it's not just the kids we are failing, it's also their parents. Right now, child support services are a bureaucratic nightmare, inefficient, hideously complex, and inaccessible to those that need them most. Let me give you an example. Maybe your kid is in a state-run early learning centre, but you get a childcare subsidy from the federal government and support from an NGO funded by both the state and the federal government. Good luck navigating that one, particularly if you're a single mum working full-time. In short, the system isn't broken, it simply does not exist. So, what's the solution? We need an early childhood system that makes life easier for parents, not harder. A system that is accessible, affordable, and high quality. Not one or the other. We need a trusted early learning centre in every community that fulfills any and every need a parent and their young child might have. A place that allows kids to experience the interactions, stimulations, and activities that science says are crucial for development. A place that allows every child in the community to have a safe space in which to play. An activity so crucial to development that it is enshrined in the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child. Imagine that. And lastly, these centres will be there for the parents. They will be a one-stop shop for all childcare services, and they will provide parents with all the information they need to support their kids' development, right from the moment the child is conceived. Not just the easy stuff like, how do I get my kid to eat broccoli, but the harder stuff like, why is my child not making eye contact with me? Why am I having trouble getting them to communicate? In my view, these high-quality early learning centres should be a basic human right. For every single Australian kid, no matter their postcode, and regardless of whether both or neither parent works. It's about uniformity, consistency, and equality of access. I've seen the power of such an approach on a visit to Chalice, a primary school just outside of Perth. And a few years ago I was there, and a young mother was sitting with me and explaining to me that her 6-year-old child was teaching her how to read. Now, some might see the injustice in this situation, a cruel turning of the tables, the child teaching the parent. I actually found it quite inspiring. It showed me how quickly we can break the intergenerational cycle of disadvantage when we get our policies and our approach right. All we want for parents is to have options. The option to access information, the option to lean on a community, the option to be fast-tracked through medical and child development services rather than waiting years or falling through the cracks. What we are talking about here is an ecosystem where support can be found when and where it's needed. And before you say, I don't need help, not from government, not from scientists, not from anyone. My parents did it this way and I'm pretty fine. I want to share with you how much I have leaned on the support of specialists and scientists as a parent. And I just need to, excuse me. Our third daughter, Matilda, arrived full term, stillborn. It tore us apart, as many other parents who have been through this will understand. But because of this experience, I reached out to Professor John Newnham, Senior Australian of the Year last year, who has set up their Women's and Infants Research Foundation. I joined their board and worked with them for years. This relationship and the research that I became immersed in is the reason I'm standing here today, and indeed why we launched the Minderoo Foundation 20 years ago. It opened my eyes to the astonishingly simple fact that from conception, the first 5 years of life are crucial to human health and happiness. Protect those years and you protect the future. And it also helped me come to terms with the loss of our daughter by giving me an understanding of what we can't control and tragically what we can't control. Tragically what we can't. Every parent struggles from time to time. We often feel lost or overwhelmed by expectations and information, or nagged, more likely, by self-doubt and guilt. That's why we need support, a system that backs us up, buffers our kids from the ups and downs, and catapults them towards success. So, how do we create this system? This year, myself and Minderoo Foundation's Thrive by 5 launched our final campaign. It's the final one because we will not stop until we achieve our goal. A high-quality early learning system for all. This doesn't just make sense for our kids, for our parents and for our society. It also makes financial sense. In 2019, Minderoo Foundation published a major report showing that Australians foot a late intervention bill of over $15 billion per annum. That's over $15 billion that is being spent tackling problems that could have been prevented had we simply invested earlier and more wisely. The cost of our inaction is stained on the government's budget papers. $5.9 billion for child protection, $2.7 billion for youth crime, $1.3 billion for mental health. And remember, this report was before COVID. But our failure to set our kids up for success has far more than economic cost. Suicide is the leading cause of death in our young people. Children as young as 10, 11 and 12. 1/3 of Indigenous children who die take their own lives. How on earth can politicians in this country pretend there is no problem here? How can we sit by and think we're doing all right when some of our children clearly lack that most basic of human rights, hope? This is not a problem that this is a problem that we, not our children, have created. Today is our line in the sand moment. We need major economic and political reform. We did it with Medicare, we did it with GST, and we did it with the NDIS. Policy must keep up with science. with what society wants and needs. Otherwise, there will be no society left to govern. Sure, it will require some upfront investment to set up such a system, and a fresh look at how we use our current funding. Of course, some of you listening may be thinking, hey, I chose not to have children, or having children is a personal choice, so why are my taxes being used like this? But let's not forget that this is the way our society works. We don't all smoke, or drink, or get cancer, or have disabilities. But we live in an advanced society where we care for everyone equally, or at least we aspire to. Of course, there are countless different ways to raise a child, and to raise a child well. But if we can at all least agree that our policies are out of date, that they do not serve the public interest, that change is critical, we will make more progress this year alone than in the past 20. Many of you will have read Peter Pan when you were a kid, the story of the boy who never grows up, whose childhood never ends. Sometimes watching toddlers at play, busily creating magnificent works of art, or as was the highlight of my day yesterday, visiting the Good Start Centre and playing with mud pies in the garden, you think they will never grow up. But our children do grow up. Every morning they wake up a day older. And I can assure you, every one of those days counts. We have 1,825 days, 5 years, to set our kids up for success. Time is running out. The government can't guarantee health and happiness for all, but at the very least, it can maximise the chance that every Australian child grows up to be a healthy, happy adult. Australia has the potential to create a system in which every family has access to the best parenting advice and the best early learning centres, staffed by friendly, highly trained specialists who you know and trust. A system that is available all the way from pregnancy through to your child's first day at school. That is what a future world-class early childhood learning system could look like. And it should be that. But we must act now. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for that speech. And Jay Weatherill, please take to the podium.
The most significant economic and social reform of our generation is within our grasp. The greatest social reform since Medicare, the most important economic reform since the opening up of our financial system. Early years reform will define the post-COVID era. It's not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. The benefits of reform are entirely predictable. High yield, low risk investment. The cost of inaction too are also entirely predictable. They're incredibly expensive. The current system is bad for children, it's bad for families, and it's bad for the economy. Right when our families need our help the most, we make it harder for them. We talk a lot about family in this nation. Our political discourse is rich with talk of family values, working families, many of which we're told are trying to make ends meet. But this is inconsistent with our behaviours. We shouldn't talk about family values if we insist on policy settings which don't value families. And there are plenty of examples of this hypocrisy, and we've seen in our current approach to the early years. Our policy settings increase pressure on families. CPI data released in late January reveals that out-of-pocket expenses are increasing across Australia in childcare area at 2.4% higher than they were last year. This is twice the rate of inflation for other goods and services. Almost half of the total increase in the CPI in the past quarter came from increased childcare costs. These significant additional costs after government subsidies over the last decade have been rising faster than electricity bills, faster than housing costs, adding to cost of living pressures. And the government's own modelling demonstrates that these costs will grow by around 4% per annum over each of the next 3 years. A few weeks ago, a federal minister tried to put these increases in context. After subsidies, the out-of-pocket expenses, he said for childcare were about $5 per hour. Doesn't sound like much, does it? Unless, of course, you're a second income earner needing to work 20 hours a week to make the family budget work. That family is $100 a week out of pocket, and that's just for one child. For 2 children, $200 out of pocket. How many Australian families think that $200 weekly impost is insignificant? Also, out-of-pocket expenses for preschool are rising. The current system is unaffordable and inconvenient for many families, which is why preschool enrolment has fallen for the 3rd consecutive year, from 92.4% in 2016 to 87.7% in 2019. So the family may be core to our political conversation, but we continue to support policies which effectively place Australian families under more pressure than in comparable countries. The accumulated burdens on families can contribute to toxic stress in children. This kind of prolonged toxic stress can disrupt the development of brain architecture and other organ systems. It can increase developmental delays leading to health problems in later life, including heart disease, diabetes, substance abuse and depression. So when families are under financial pressure, it's the children who suffer with long-term effects on their learning, behaviour and health. Now, the Commonwealth invests significant amounts of money into childcare subsidies, around $8.5 billion. It also provides a further $433 million to states and territories for funding preschool. Some would say this is enough. But what do we get for this investment? Early learning centres in Australia are of inconsistent quality and affordability. The Productivity Commission recently reported another increase in regulatory breaches in childcare centres in Australia. Around 16% of childcare centres don't meet national quality standards. And the Commonwealth can't even reliably measure attendance at preschool because the data collected by states and territories is not on attendance but on enrolment. But as I've observed, enrolments are dropping, so we expect the same is likely to be occurring in relation to attendances. If the government is investing heavily and fees keep rising, where's the money going? Well, it's certainly not going to our educators, who are undervalued. Builders labourers take home $1,458 each week with entry-level skills. Concreters, also with entry-level skills, $2,100 a week. Childcare workers, who must have Certificate 3 qualifications, $953 a week. It's not enough, nowhere near enough for the essential service they provide. Now, of course, workers who build our homes toil hard and have every right to a decent wage. But the work undertaken by our early years educators is nation building. They help parents to understand that every moment, every word, every interaction with their child has the potential to stimulate 1 million neural connections every second. They provide the opportunities for play-based learning so crucial for our child's development, and they provide the special support for families in need. Children with disabilities need and want the same things that every child wants and needs. But with undervalued and insecure work comes a high staff turnover. Pre-COVID staff turnover in early learning centres is estimated at around 30%. This disrupts the continuity of relationships that are built between educators and families, which we know is so crucial to the quality of services provided to children. Is it any surprise off the back of this that we have a skills shortage, with around 10% of long daycare centres granting exemptions from national quality standards in relation to qualifications? Governments should seize the opportunity and work with TAFE to address the skills shortage and fulfil the high demand for qualified early childhood educators. A functioning system relies upon qualified, well-paid educators in secure work. Now, any discussion that we have in this topic in the early years is usually characterised as social policy, a net drain on the economic resources of our nation. But what if we recalibrated early years policy? What if we looked at it through an economic lens? It's a common refrain that economic growth is driven by the 3 Ps: participation, productivity and population. Participation. Our economy needs to mobilise all of the talents and resources at its disposal, especially in the context of slowing rates of migration. Any disincentive to join or rejoin the workforce is a drag on our economy. But for many families, both parents need to work to cover the costs of living. Balancing work and bringing up children is a challenge, but it shouldn't be this hard. We can design a system which satisfies both needs. Recent work by KPMG and Grattan Institute shows that our current tax and transfer systems, combined with the cost of childcare, delays a return to the workforce for many Australian parents. The downstream effects for Australian mothers on their career progression, their financial security, and ultimately their superannuation are real. But the reforms we're proposing will have an immediate positive impact on participation. The quality of early learning also affects the second P, productivity. The Blueprint Institute, a centre-right think tank, believes productivity to be the most significant economic benefit that would arise from reform to our early years system. Early childhood is a time of rapid change, especially for the development of executive functions which can set up a child for lifelong success. These executive functions and essential life skills include attention and focus, responding to emotions, relationships and communication, planning and routines, and taking on challenges. The very skills on which all later skills are developed, or as Nobel Prize winner James Heckman puts it, skills beget skills. It contributes to the 13% return on investment in early childhood development. Currently, around 22% of Australian children enter primary school developmentally vulnerable. Little wonder that Australia produces mediocre and worsening PISA results. As repetitive process jobs are eliminated by new technology, the jobs of the future will increasingly draw on these executive skills. Therefore, the quality of early learning today directly affects national productivity tomorrow. The third P is population. And as parents consider the costs of raising children, choices about having families, the size of those families, are affected by things like the cost of childcare, long daycare, preschool, and also the ease of access of these arrangements. Past guardians of conservative politics have thought about these issues. Peter Costello famously introduced the baby bonus to encourage parents to have one for mum, one for dad, and one for the country. And he wasn't saying this because 3 was his favourite number. He was saying this because he understood the clear link between population growth and economic growth. Our global competitors understand this. It's not for nothing that Japan, where population has been in decline since 2011 and workforce participation for women has historically been low relative to other developed economies, has invested heavily in preschool education. In 2019, its Conservative government amended the Children and Child Rearing Support Act to make public preschool universal for all children aged 3 and 4 years. If Australia does not reform its early learning system, we will be uncompetitive within a generation. Now, we pride ourselves in this nation as being an easygoing, outdoor lifestyle country, a great place to grow up. But the reality for many families is that life is tough. We're not a child-friendly or a parent-friendly society, and our policies reflect it. We should insist on policies that make Australia the greatest place in the world to grow up, the greatest place in the world to be a parent. Policies that relieve pressure for Australian families in the interests of both parents and children. All policies should be measured against 3 tests. How do they reduce the pressure on families? How do they increase capabilities of parents and educators? And what is best for children? How can we honestly say that we're measuring up against any of these objectives? Now, we of course can settle for this mediocre system, which isn't working for anyone. Or we can create a system which within a single generation will connect parents to the support and services they need at high quality places, a pram-friendly walk from their homes, where children are expertly led through high quality learning experiences. A system in which parents are empowered to make choices about work and family free of financial pressure, where they're empowered with knowledge and capability to bring up their children to be the very best they can be, which the unique needs of every child are met by highly trained and valued educators who form trusted relationships with parents and caregivers and children. So how are we going to achieve this? Well, we're going to campaign. What is our campaign goal? We want an early learning system which is affordable, accessible and high quality. How are we going to achieve this? Well, we're going to put pressure on the political process. If our elected representatives in state and federal parliaments are comfortable wearing the social and economic costs of inactivity, they should know that this is going to come at a political cost. Parents are a political mobile constituency, and they have lived experience of an unaffordable, time-consuming, bureaucratic early learning system. Minderoo Foundation will help to bring together a broad constituency for change from across the political spectrum. We'll run a sophisticated, well-funded campaign. We'll be talking to educators, parents, their children, and concerned citizens in marginal seats across Australia as part of a national roadshow. We will develop new platforms to allow their voices to be heard in parliaments around Australia. If you spend time on social media, you will see our message. Know our goal. We have a vision for Australia in 2030 in which every child thrives by 5. These outcomes are well within our reach and well within our capabilities as a nation. Now, Nicola and I have arrived at this place from quite different paths. But having heard and understood the way in which babies' brains develop and how profound it is for their health, learning and behavioural trajectory, and what this means for not only our children but for our nation and its prosperity, we're convinced that there is no more important public policy issue facing our country. Both of us have tried hard to effect change. Both of us have been disappointed about what we've been able to achieve to this point. But both of us are determined, and both of us believe that it is time. It is time for a new early learning system for Australia.
All right, well, thank you, Nicola and Jay, for really engaging and strong arguments that you've made there. So obviously your aim is very clear, to create a universal, accessible, affordable childcare system. So if you were sitting around the cabinet table up at Parliament House and you were able to redesign the childcare early learning system we have, what does your dream system look like? And I suppose the really meaty part of it is, how much does it cost and who pays?
Welcome to the press club.
Well, I might have a crack at it first and then Nicola.
You have been in government before, in the cabinet table, so you know, familiar with the process.
Well, I think we've sketched out the essential elements of it. Universality, high quality. I think the other element of it is to make sure that it's connected, so all of these disparate service systems across lots of different areas, because when you talk about the early years, there's infant and maternal health, there's child protection, preschool, childcare, family and community services. So it's a complex service system. So integration of those things. Place-based, they need to be contextual. Aboriginal communities in Bidjadanga are going to look very different from Peppermint Grove in Perth. So it will look different in different parts of the country. And I think accountable, and we think accountable to a line of sight to the education system, which ultimately is these children walk through the school gate at 5 years of age, and we know, as Nicola has just said, so much of the trajectory has already been established. So having that line of sight to children so that we can support them. So they're the essential elements of the system. As for the cost question, well, we're already paying the bill. We're paying $15 billion in the cost of late intervention. And frankly, any sensible discussion of cost has to look at the benefits. We've seen the modelling that's been done by the Grattan Institute that talks about an investment of $4 billion in childcare gives you a $7 billion uplift in terms of economic activity. But, you know, the cost question there, the first cab off the rank, though, is for governments around this country to accept there's a problem and establish a vision for the solution. Now, nobody expects this thing's going to be built overnight. It will take time to build it out, and there are steps that can be taken along the way. But the first step is there is a problem, we're not doing the right thing by the early years, and establish this vision of a high quality, universally accessible early learning system for our country.
Did you want to add?
Well, Jane, yeah, thank you. I think what is so evident is that we have a good maternal health system here in Australia. We bring our babies in very well. And we've got a pretty good education system, although the results are not looking as good as they should. It's those 4 years in between. And so it's actually the willingness that Jay is talking about. It is actually a willingness to do things differently. I have got frustrated, and I was in Parliament yesterday, it was good for before this, because often the conversation goes straight down to, well, what's the subsidy and how many hours, and it's not putting the child at the centre of this. It's got to be a holistic approach and a willingness to do it. And in fact, you know, never waste a crisis. COVID has given us the architecture to be able to do this. The National Cabinet, the meeting of the, you know, there's a bit of a blame game. There's the interconnection between state, federal and the funding. It's just too confusing. So a willingness to come to the table and simplify it. And I have always argued that this isn't necessarily about any more money. We are spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in all sorts of communities around this country. And you know, we've had a targeted approach, and I came from you've got to just target the most vulnerable. But actually, it's not working because those most vulnerable are the last people to access the services that we're putting there for them. So this is about making people feel connected to a community. And it's not about an infrastructure project of going and building centres. They're already there. It might be the childcare centre. It might be the primary school. It could be a library. It's about a place where it's a one-stop shop. It's not rocket science.
And just before we go to our first question, when we talk about universality in Australia, your mind immediately goes to Medicare, right? Like universal access to healthcare. That is largely taxpayer funded through a levy. So just to stay on the economic side of it for one moment, would you, I suppose, advocate for childcare to be entirely taxpayer funded, to be government funded?
I think the details about how this system will be constructed are things that will have to be worked through. There's no doubt this is big reform, and there are some sensible things that could be done in the near term. That, for instance, we don't even have a properly functioning national partnership in relation to 4-year-old preschool. We've got this thing that gets drip-fed out every year, and there are significant questions about whether some vulnerable communities are having the sort of service that's covered. So this doesn't necessarily have to be bitten off in one chunk. It can be approached over time, but the vision has to be made clear. The vision of universally accessible, high-quality early learning, because any investment can only be seen in the context of the benefits. It's like anything that's worth having in life. Sometimes you have to invest to actually realise the return, and that's what the evidence is, just so patently clear that investing in the early years gives you extraordinary rates of return. You've got any number of reports that are stacked a mile high that tells you that the rates of return for investment in the early years repay the investment over and over.
Right. Our first question is Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review.
Andrew Tillett, thank you very much. Jay, Nicola, thanks very much for your presentation, your speeches. As a voter, as a journalist and as a parent of a 2-year-old, I want to know who I can blame when things go wrong, if it's a hospital, if it's schools or whatever. Picking up on Jane's question, which sort of arm of government would you see best placed to sort of administer, run, finance these early learning centres to get that accountability? I mean, we have, as you both alluded to, we have a situation where schools are run, the education system is largely a state responsibility. We have the childcare system now, which is essentially funded by the federal government with a view as essentially a workforce participation, family budget type of mindset and things like that. Do you imagine these early learning centres, is it just a matter of bolting them onto the state-run systems, or is it sort of a federally run system? And particularly, Jay, given your time as a Premier, you sat around plenty of COAG meetings with Colin Barnett, had issues trying to get him over the line on things like disability, NDIS, health, Gonski. How can you sort of corral all the leaders of the states and the federal government into achieving this?
I just asked if I could go first because I've just got an anecdote really. Jay's got more experience in this. But it can be done and it has been done. And it's been done despite the system, and it's been done because of the persistence of people that have refused to accept that their children and their electorate are going to continue failing. So, you know, we've done it in Western Australia at Chalice, and it's now held up and people say Chalice is amazing. I try not to mention it because it's not just about Chalice, but it's actually the willingness to do it. So who do you blame? It's all of us, because children, it should be whole of government approach. It's not, it affects health, it affects education, and it should be linked to education. The education system, as everyone's heard today, those first few years are the foundation blocks for that bridge between the years to build our future capacity and productivity of this nation. So it's a whole of government approach, and all of us are accountable.
Yeah, I agree, and I think Nicola's point earlier about the National Cabinet as a new piece of architecture, which didn't exist when I was Premier. I had a bit of a crack at trying to get this issue up in COAG, and COAG is a pretty glacial process, and just when you think you're getting somewhere, some other crisis intervenes and you get shuffled to the bottom of the queue. So whereas National Cabinet puts the Premiers, Chief Ministers and the Prime Minister face to face more often, and so something like this does require deep dialogue. Nobody's pretending that unscrambling this tangle of responsibilities is easy, and I suppose I have a bias coming from a state jurisdiction. I'm always a bit sceptical about the Commonwealth's capacity to do service delivery well, but I've also, what Commonwealth is good at is funding and accountability and frameworks. They hold the state's feet to the fire when they don't, because they've got the big picture. They have to look at the nation, and if there's a laggard state or territory, or if certain subsections of the community are not being properly attended to, the Commonwealth can call that out because it has the big data collection capability. So somewhere there'll be some sensible allocation of responsibilities as between the Commonwealth and the states. I can't imagine, though, the point I made earlier, that it's a very big nation with very different needs in different parts of the nation. So I think it'd have to be something that accommodates place-based solutions.
Absolutely. It has to be community-driven.
Lani Scarr from the West Australian.
Lani Scarr from the West Australian. Thank you so much both for your speeches. In many countries that do really well in regards to childcare and early childhood education, their systems are predominantly publicly run and funded. So in Australia, we have privately run centres and privately run operators or privately owned operators that have turned childcare into lucrative billion-dollar businesses. So has the privatisation of childcare contributed to the broken system that we now have? And in an environment where the government is focused on rolling out the COVID vaccine, they're focused on stabilising the economy and keeping a strong economy, how can you be sure that politicians will care about this issue as a top-tier issue right now?
Maybe I might take the second bit first.
But you still have to answer the first question.
I haven't forgotten the first bit because you only just asked it a short while ago. The second bit is what the campaign's about. I mean, the whole point is to put this on the political agenda, and as Nicola has said, we're not going away, and we're going to keep campaigning until we are successful. And it's not just us. I mean, we're just the vehicle for bringing together a whole range of people across this country, many of whom have been at this much longer than we have. And so it'll be the strength. It'll be those voices. I mean, Nicola has got 100 stories in her hands there of people that have told their stories, and we're going to represent them, and they'll become powerful, and they'll resonate politically. Look, as for the private for-profit question, there's no doubt that that sector is overrepresented in some of the centres that have quality standard issues. So that is a concern. We need to get to the bottom of why it can be that the Commonwealth keeps pouring money into this system, but fees keep rising, but wages don't keep rising. So there is definitely an issue that needs to be grappled with there. Quite what the system is going to look like yet, we're not really in that phase, if you like, of the campaign. We still haven't persuaded the Commonwealth and the states there's a big enough problem that they need to lean into it. That's where we're at in the phase in the campaign. We're doing some thinking about what a great system would look like, but even Medicare, does provide for private for-profit providers. What role they would play in a universally accessible, high-quality system is the jury's still out on that. But I think we haven't got a settled view about that. That the touchstone is universal, accessible, high-quality early learning for every child.
Yeah, not one or the other. And I think that is the heart of it. There's sort of this distrust that the outcomes aren't being measured. So Jay talked about enrolments and attendance aren't necessarily correlated. And what we're talking about here is people's lives. So outcomes actually matter. It's not about whether you attended or you didn't or how many hours you went for. Are you actually hitting the milestones? So the quality framework, which was set up many years ago, was a great start to this. So how we're continuing to fail that, people have to be held accountable, whether you're public or private. And I really think it's important. This is not about a government instructed program that is compulsory. This is actually about giving parents options and giving them the choice. And then if they want to pay more money because they think this service provides more for their child, then that they would have to pay the bit on top. Do you know what I mean? But the standard should be consistent, and it should be accessible, and it should be affordable. If people want a gold-plated bowl or something, they can pay more for it.
You talk about having to start by convincing politicians at the state and Commonwealth levels that there is a problem. Federally, though, clearly Labor believes there is a problem because it's unveiled a new childcare policy that effectively would offer more assistance to more families, removing the annual cap, increasing the maximum subsidy. Is this going down the right track? Is this heading towards the kind of system that you want? What do you think of that policy?
Yeah, I mean, there are 3 recent policy announcements that have been made by governments around the country, oppositions and governments around the country, which have been significant improvements. One right here in the ACT, rolling out 3-year-old preschool, which is a fantastic reform agenda. The second, rolling out 3-year-old preschool in Victoria. And the third is, as you've mentioned, the federal opposition making a contribution towards improving the affordability and accessibility of early learning. So we think they're good starts. They're not the entire system. We think we've got a much bigger set of reforms in mind, but they're excellent starts.
All right, next question, Nick Stewart from the Canberra Times.
Thank you very much. Nicola, it was wonderful because we don't always get the opportunity here at the National Press Club to see someone emotional about what they're talking about, someone who feels it deeply inside. And that came across very much in your speech. Jay, you talked about pushing on an open door. And I can see that. But then you come down to the nitty-gritty, the detail. For example, which year should people, how old should people be when they actually begin school? And then you get the state versus state issues, and you get all these little complications where people say, oh no, we're different and we've got to do it in our own way. How is it, can we reconceive this perhaps as an information problem where you're getting different groups to work forward for their children to some extent against the bureaucracies that are existing? And do we need to look at things that way? And is providing information to parents really the key to this, so that they can actually make the decision that in WA there are better ways of dealing with early childcare information? Is that what it is? Because otherwise I just wonder whether or not no politician will ever say they're not in favour of looking after young children, but on the other hand you'll end up falling into a melange where you just get nowhere through all these good, well-meaning politicians who don't actually achieve anything.
Nick, that's exactly why we launched the campaign, because this is to represent the voices that have been fractured as well. The complaint, from the working people to the children that are there, to the parents that are having to deal with this system, to policymakers that have been speaking to hollow halls. And this is about uniting those voices. There are several, there's only some basic things that are needed to be pulled together, but we have to have a united voice. And this campaign, this is just one small part of it, is actually about helping give that voice so that it's heard very loudly here in Canberra. And, with an election coming up and people in their electorates, we need to demand that vision that Jay is talking about. We need to set the bar high.
I agree entirely with that. The other part of your question was the empowering parents, and we haven't spoken about this today, but it sort of raises one of the initiatives of the foundation is a parenting app, so I think called Bright Tomorrows, which essentially puts information about how a child's brain develops in the hands of parents. It's 1,000 activities of daily living, meaningful moments builds babies' brains is the byline for this app, and it's about
Free to download.
Free download, that's right. Click on, you don't have to buy any sort of nappies or any other, there's no cross promotion. It's all completely free, and it's got the best neuroscience backing it up. But it is about that notion of empowering parents with the skills and capabilities they need. So this is quite a complex service system. It's not like getting a service on a bus where you turn up and it happens. This is a complex interaction between the service system and the parent, because most of the work, most of the important things is actually going to go on in the home. And the practitioner, we like to talk about the parenting app as the bridge between the neuroscience and the practitioner, the early educator, and the parent and the child. So that's what we've been doing as part of this whole exercise.
Because as parents learn more, they're going to ask for more, you know.
Olivia Caisley from The Australian.
Olivia Caisley from The Australian, thank you very much for your speech. The budget last year was criticised for being too blokey. Do you agree? And given the clear social and economic evidence for a universal childcare policy, why isn't the Morrison government pursuing this?
Well, there's no doubt that the current system really punishes women. I mean, second income earner is typically a woman. And we've got, I think the highest rate of female educational attainment in the world, #1. But in terms of the support for early learning, we're actually a very long way down the list. And what that translates into is one of the highest rates of female part-time employment in the world. So we've got all these highly educated and talented women who are close to the peak of their productivity, and we're not actually utilising their services, and we need them. We need them in our economy, and many of those women are demanding this for their own well-being and the way in which they want to live their lives. Look, I don't want to buy into the to the broader sort of characterisation of the government on gender issues, but I think it would be dangerous for the government to allow a narrative to develop that it has a tin ear to women's issues. And now a gap's been opened up between the two major political parties on this question in what most people predict to be an election year. That seems to be, from my perspective, a dangerous political equation for the government.
Do you think momentum is building on this for the Morrison government to either match Labor's policy or at least, make this budget less blue, more pink?
I'd prefer you to write that. That would be a good thing for you to write.
But would you expect, politically, that the government might actually have to
I think
move
it's a
on
big
this?
risk. I mean, if I was sitting there wanting, just a purely political calculation, somebody's right and somebody's wrong about whether this is politically salient. Labor thinks it's politically salient. Our research tells us that about 2/3 of people think this is a good idea and it should happen. You'd be a brave person that just decided to ignore this issue and hope that it went away.
I mean, this is political reform that has to happen and social reform that has to happen. Our childcare policies haven't really shifted. In the last 30 years, women's roles have emerged. And in fact, as Jay just said, the women that are most affected are our most educated. That university trained, highly intelligent, they're actually penalised for going back to work. And I've spoken to so many people even since I've been here in Canberra, some of you journalists with children, the costs that people are spending and the trouble that it's creating for their own careers. And children thrive when their parents are happy and healthy and being able to provide for them. And so this is about, if you support women, you support society. You lift families and children and you lift the whole of society. This is about rising the tide for everybody.
Right, our next question is Norman's. Oh, I think, sorry, we'll go Norman Swan. Sorry, Georgie, you're next. Radio National's Health Report.
Thanks very much. My question is, let's assume the vision's accepted. I want to hear more about the practical stuff. If you get the sequencing wrong, you could make this worse. So if you suddenly remove the cost pressure, demand goes up. You've already admitted there's unacceptable variation between childcare centres or early child education despite regulation. What's the sequence of things? So let's say you've got a sympathetic politician. What's the sequence of stuff that needs to happen in a very practical way to move forward?
Short answer is, I don't know, but we're working on that question. And the reason why I want to be clear with you about that is that it is incredibly complex stuff. I mean, we are because the point you made is true. Some jurisdictions that have gone quickly into the expansion of their early learning system have led to significant quality issues. So you would have to travel, the reform would have to travel together at the same pace of reform to your workforce development question. So one of the things that's going on at the moment is the Commonwealth are engaged in a workforce development plan. It's about to go out for public consultation, but unless that's properly resourced, this 10% of centres which is seeking to have exemptions from the existing qualification standards, you can imagine that situation is only going to worsen. So that's an important issue. I think there are some steps that could be taken which incrementally build out this reform, and I alluded to one of them earlier. One is to give a proper national partnership in relation to 4-year-old preschool. At the moment we've got this 1-year drip feed that just keeps rolling out. Nobody can invest with any certainty. We could extend the 4-year-old preschool to 3-year-old preschool. A couple of jurisdictions are already on the way, and we could take that step. So they're two ways in which we could begin to build out the current system. We could do it in a way which the workforce reform could travel at the same pace. But there are some really complex public policy questions about how do we incorporate, across a universal platform, how do we incorporate targeted services and how do they integrate with the universal platforms? How do we make sure that we have services that meet the unique needs of particular communities, Aboriginal communities, to make sure that they're community controlled and culturally safe? How do we make sure that we properly integrate the system of infant and maternal health care system? And if this does exist at a state level, how do we take a federal government funded childcare system, which is an uncapped demand-driven system, and have that incorporated into a state-based service system? These are ferociously complex public policy questions, but the first step is to one, accept you've got a problem, which we're not there yet. Secondly, to lay out the vision, because once you lay out the vision about what a great system looks like, you can start knocking off some of these questions. Once everybody buys in to this vision, you can then start working through all of these questions sequentially. Now Minderoo is supporting a bunch of very clever people, existing past public servants and experts in the field to do this thinking. So there's a lot of thinking that's going on behind the scenes to try and assist us to come up with the answers to your question. But that's a long way of saying I don't know the answer to the question.
But I'm very glad he's on my side.
All right, well, just for the last few minutes, we'll take a slightly more unconventional approach because we have some advocates and MPs in the audience who have a keen interest in this policy area, and one of them is Georgie Dent from the Parenthood.
Georgie Dent from the Parenthood. I thank you both for your speeches today. I think they were terrific. I am interested in both of your views on the disconnect that I think exists between what we know the evidence shows us and what people in Australia accept. And I'm not just talking about our government leaders. I think that even just on the way here today, when the taxi driver asked what I was coming to and I explained the cause of the event, and he said, but we'd be pretty good at that, wouldn't we? We published a piece of research this week looking at Australia's policies that support parents, and it makes very clear that Australia lags developed countries when it comes to these areas, and we know that children are suffering as a result. The evidence that children are suffering is not new. We know that a lot of the evidence, for example, UNICEF last year rated Australia 32nd out of 41 countries for child wellbeing. It specifically noted that we are failing in delivering consistent health, social benefits for children. That report was published last year, but the information was pre-COVID. We know that what happened in 2020 has only exacerbated the pressure and stress that parents and children are suffering. You touched on, Nicola, the mental health concerns, and that is a real issue. My question is, how do we bridge the gap between the reality that we are failing children and the narrative that I think persists that Australia is doing a good enough job in this area?
Georgie, your report is fantastic, and congratulations on launching it. Good timing this week. I think that's very much at the heart of this campaign, is arming parents with that information, because I think most people think, oh, we're the lucky country, everyone has a fair go, we're doing okay. I know I have shifted my thinking a lot in the time that I've been involved in trying to, echo out the problems. And a couple of years ago I was asked to join a board called the Valuing Children's Initiative, and it was really interesting because it was actually about our cultural attitude towards our children. And I grew up in country New South Wales and had conservative parents who made education was the most important thing. I'd like to thank my mother for being here today. And I think I had probably pretty norm attitudes around, well, it's people's free choice. People choose to go that path, or if people choose not to work, then why should we pay for their children to, I'm not echoing myself necessarily, but, society has shifted and our policy hasn't kept up with the science or the cultural norms of today. And that is why, if parents don't understand the importance, then they're not demanding it of the services that are being delivered. So if it's driven, the campaign is very much about putting that information into the hands of those people that need it most, parents and caregivers. And I've visited so many different childcare centres and kindergartens, and those people are the heroes. They love their work. And today, I felt a little bit, my husband's, a few people came up to me and said, oh my God, you're here and I'm coming to listen to you speak. Because they were childcare workers, and that one of them had a PhD. And guess what? They can't afford to pay their mortgage by working in the area where they trained and put their heart and soul, because they couldn't afford to stay there. So the shift is coming, and I don't know if I answered your question.
You did, and I think the other part of the answer is when we research this. So when we put these narratives about things we've been talking to in front of people, their top of mind view might be one thing, but it's very easy to take them to support this position. So we think about 2/3 of people support this idea that we're putting out there. So we are pushing against an open door. And I think but you've got to translate that. So we've got a public campaign, and today's part of it is to put these messages in front of the Australian people, get them to in turn put pressure on their politicians. So that's why you should go to thriveby5.org.au and register. My chief executive wants me to get my registrations up for the website, and that will be that supporter journey will allow us to then start putting pressure on the political process.
All right, we're nearly out of time. We have time for 2 short questions, and Zali Steggles next, independent member for Warringah.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the speeches. It was really interesting to hear your perspective, but also the views. I guess as someone in Parliament listening and wanting to put forward solutions, I feel a frustration that this often gets overly politicised and becomes a political football, again, from one side to the other. Do you think the barriers of why we haven't progressed are that it's been looked at as a social nice to have as opposed to an economic necessity? Is it not enough women around the decision-making tables, but also why should it be about women prioritising this and not men as well? And that touches on parental leave, where we have such a poor uptake of fathers in Australia on parental leave. So I guess it's a broad question, but those barriers, where do you see those key barriers as being?
Sally, I heard you speak actually on the at the launch on Monday, and I thought I want to meet you, so I'm so glad you're here. I think you're touching on all of those barriers, that it has been, women have been more adversely affected and haven't been at the table. So having you and Anne Rushton and the women here that are in the Parliament, it shouldn't just be an issue for women. And some of the keen advocates, the only Minister for Children we've ever had in this country is here with us today, and it's great to have you here. Larry Anthony. You know, there used to be a focus on this in governments previously, and I agree with you. We don't want it to become a political football and then we settle for, oh, well, that's okay. It's about whichever government takes this forward is going to be known as the transformational, because yes, it is absolutely economic reform. All the figures are there. It shows the kickstart. You know, there's a triple dividend by investing in women, by investing in families and children and making us more productive and more capable people. It's going to pay into our future prosperity of this nation. And at the moment, we're looking down the barrel of it going the other way. So it is an absolute necessity. It's not just a social reform. It is economic.
And the final question today is, sorry, Zali, Gráinne O'Loughlin from Karitani.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentation today. So Gráinne O'Loughlin from Karitani. You have both touched on so many elements. There's so much wisdom there. Karitani is an organisation that's been providing parenting and child and family health support for nearly 100 years. So I feel there's many of us in the room in the sector that you're preaching to the converted. And so it's not the what we need to do or why we need to do it, it's the how we need to do it. And Nicola, you touched on the importance of social connectedness and community connections. And I'm really interested when you talk about transforming the ecosystem, so the health, the social, mental health, welfare system and education system, and the how we're going to do it. Not just how we're going to do it, but how long is it going to take us? Because this campaign is focused on a why we need to do it, when there's so many of us ready to say, how are we going to do it? And that's what I'm really, really interested to hear about today.
Can I, and don't take this the wrong way, because I feel the same way. I love talking about getting in the sandpit with all the policy papers and trying to work out the problem. That's something that really... But the political process demands something different. If you want politicians to act, they're not going to solve a problem they don't think they have.
Yeah.
So our first strategic goal as a campaign is to lay the table out in terms of what the problem is. Now, for a lot of people here, they're pretty clear about what the problem is, but you've got to share that with other people. That's why our campaign is sort of many voices, one message, to try and get a clear goal and share these stories. So these 100 voices that are really part of that process. So I don't want to avoid the question. There's a lot of complexity in that, and I also don't want to tell you that that work isn't going on, because it is.
Yeah.
But in terms of our public stance. We've still got to take a whole lot of people with us who think, as Nicola said, 80% is okay. You know, maybe 80% of kids are going okay. So what's the problem? Mm-hmm. Well, you know, that we've got a lot of work to do to shift that momentum, and I think our meetings in Parliament the last few days shows that we've got a bit of work to do.
But thank you for your work, and I couldn't agree more. That's what sort of has sparked my frustration, because you talk to people and they go, well, we know all that. And then you think, well, why don't we do things differently? And there's that lag. And it has been so fantastic to have Jay join our team and lead this work, because he understands what this takes. You know, I'm not known for my patience.
All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, let's conclude on that note, because we're going to get to question time. But please thank our guests today, Nicola, Forrest and Jay Weatherill.